All right, we're going to go ahead and get things started today. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. We're really excited to welcome all of you here today to join us for our Fall Housing Policy Forum, Legislative Year in Review, Policy Trends and Highlights. Throughout today's forum, we invite you all to submit questions to our speakers through the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your screen. Please don't be shy, and please ask as many questions as you all like. Thank you again for joining us today. My name is Carrie Simmons, and I'm an Associate Regional Planner on SANDAG's Sustainable Communities team here at SANDAG. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome SANDAG's CEO, Mario Orso, who will be kicking off today's event. Mario joined SANDAG this June as our new CEO and brings with him more than 32 years of experience at Caltrans, where he most recently served as Chief Deputy Director of Caltrans District 11. And so with that, I want to pass it over to Mario, who will be sharing some opening remarks.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for that, Carrie. I want to just thank everybody for the opportunity to be here and be able to welcome you in this very important housing forum. Like Carrie mentioned, I was actually 33 years with the state, and I'm very excited to bring in my experience in project delivery, coordination, partnerships, and engagements to SANDAG. Now, SANDAG plays a very critical role in the region in building and planning the transportation network and basically partnering with many agencies, local governments, the transit agencies, Caltrans, and others. So it is very important. Housing is a significant challenge, not just in San Diego, but all over the nation. And it's something that we're going to need to tackle as a group. And this type of forums allows the conversations and the evaluation of what tools are available in the toolbox. There are different subjects that need to be considered: inclusiveness, equity, the environmental impacts, the environment itself, sustainability, the economy. So those are deep challenges to balance when you're talking about housing policy. SANDAG plays a very important role in developing the regional transportation plan and also the sustainable community strategy. So we're very excited to participate and be part of in housing this forum here right now. You know, we also do the assessment of the regional housing needs in a regular manner. I think it's every 8 years that we're in charge to do that. So, like I've said before, SANDAG is the place where this type of conversations happen. And we're really, really excited for you all to be part of this forum. So I just want to welcome you, and I wish you the best in this forum. And I hope it's really informative, and it really provides the tools that can help shape or manage our housing needs and challenges that we have in the region. Thank you again, and have a very nice one.
Thank you, Mario. Thank you, Mario, for that introduction today, and we're excited to get into it. Here on the screen is the agenda, and I'm going to really briefly walk you through what we'll be covering today. So first, we're going to go through an overview of the 2023-2024 legislative session. We'll then break out into some audience Q&A and answer some of those questions you all have submitted in the chat or in the Q&A function. We'll then go into a panel with some panelists that we've invited today to speak. We'll ask them about some of their reactions to trends, the budgets, and some of the upcoming bills. We'll then break out into another audience Q&A session, and then finally we'll end with some closing remarks. And I would like to note that following this session, we will be sharing out recording and the slide deck to all of the registered attendees, and I'll also be posting it on SANDAG's housing website, so you'll be able to access it all there. Thanks. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our legislative and budget speaker, Holly from Anita De Jesus. Holly leads significant state legislative initiatives that have shaped housing policy at the state level and directly supported local and regional affordable housing preservation, production, and protection efforts statewide. She's also the lead lobbyist and strategist for the Committee to House the Bay Area, CASA, in 2019, United Way Greater Los Angeles, Habitat for Humanity California, SPUR, California YIMBY, and the San Diego Housing Commission. And finally, she has over a decade of experience specializing in creative legislative campaign strategies that have overcome relentless grassroots oppositions to local planning and housing policy reforms. And Holly, with that, I will pass it over to you to take it away.
Great. Thank you, Carrie. It's nice to see some names that I recognize from last year giving a legislative update, and I'm really happy to be back again and be able to share my experience because I am what I like to call boots on the ground in the state capitol. I live just minutes from the Capitol, and I've now spent over 25 years of my career here and doing direct lobbying for the last 22. I'm been focused on housing for the last decade. So very excited to share some insights on what happened this session. Next slide, please. So just quick overview of how I'm going to organize this presentation, because I think we're together till about 12:50. So I'm going to organize it in 3 different segments. There's first to give you, which I think is really important to understand, the political landscape and some of the changes that have happened and kind of the backdrop in Sacramento that is like guided and led to the legislative outcomes, both budget outcomes as well as legislative outcomes that we'll get into more detail at towards the end of the presentation. But also we'll get a little bit more into the weeds, but not too far into the weeds on budget cuts and a lot of the things that many of you I think are already familiar with. But if there's specific questions on that topic, I'll be happy to answer, but not going to spend too much time there. We could spend an entire hour just talking about the budget cuts and some of those fiscal realities that the state's been dealing with. But a really important piece of this puzzle is also the ballot initiatives, both the state level and regional initiatives I'll talk about. And then finally, we'll be diving deeper into the different policies that made it to the governor's desk, and I'll highlight a few that didn't make it, and some, and again, the political realities and reasons why some of those bills did not make it to the governor's desk. And during the Q&A period, please have your questions, have those bill numbers and those questions waiting till the very end, and then we can dive deeper as necessary and the different things that we cover ahead of time. All right, next. Okay, so political landscape. This is, again, a very important thing for folks to be familiar with to hopefully understand a lot of the actions that took place this year, and especially the end of session. For anybody that was watching the end of session, it was in my 20 years, it was the most crazy and chaotic end of session I've ever experienced, with like an auctioneer style of last minute, about 40 bills being heard in the last 30 minutes of the legislative session. Folks even asked me, what happened? Like, why this year? Why was it so chaotic and felt so dysfunctional? Well, I like to point to leadership. Everything starts at the top. And this year was the first time that we had new leadership in both the Senate side and the Assembly side. We had a new pro tem and a new speaker. Even though the speaker took over being speaker at the end of the last session, this was really his first year of guiding and being the leader of the full session. So we had 2 new leaders, and we had a ton of different committee changes during this year. And I think that is what results in dysfunction. I think you got to, just like anything else, you got to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And also, it was an election year, and it really is not just an important presidential year, but all of the elections. There's not a lot of open seats and targeted seats, meaning Republican on Republican and Democrat on Democrat. There's a lot of that going on in this state this year in the November election. But also, there are a few targeted seats that are Republicans and Democrats, and there actually might be a flip. So the Democrats still control a supermajority in both houses, both in the Assembly and the Senate. And even losing 1 or 2 seats isn't going to change it that much. But a real political reality that we've seen in Sacramento since the open primary and this top 2 election in the primary that leads to the general, we've seen a lot of changes in Democrats and the Democratic caucus splits on a number of issues, and they don't vote in a 2/3 voting block, and especially when it comes to housing policy. So why I highlight this and why I love being a lobbyist and working on housing policy is because No, like Republicans do not always follow Republicans, and Democrats do not always follow Democrats in how they vote on housing policy. They really do vote with their district and looking at how their district views the different housing policies and the budget actions that are being taken place. So the leaders in both houses, both the Senate and the Assembly, when they're trying to help figure out where the votes are, there's the incumbents that are at risk of maybe losing their seat. Like there's a couple of Northern California seats in a Northern Los Angeles seat. A lot of times a member will have to lay off the bill, and the speaker will have to have that person lay off of the bill because it's too much risk for them to vote for a housing policy that their district doesn't like and the constituents don't like, because they're worried that it can be something that could attack them later in an election. So every time there's an election year, it definitely changes the politics and changes the vote counts on the floor, especially those final vote counts on the floor on some of the bills that are the trickiest bills and the most controversial bills. But I know in other presentations you might hear a lot of folks still try to say that, again, the Republicans are not relevant. And I would say that the term not relevant is definitely not when it comes to housing bills, but definitely when it comes to the budget. When I first came to Sacramento, the budget was based on, we used to say that the big five used to get together and negotiate the budget was the governor, the two Republican leaders, and the two Democrat leaders. Nowadays, it really is the big three when it comes to the budget, but the Republican caucus and Republican leadership, though, is very influential when it comes to passing housing policy bills that do eventually make it to the governor, and they are really relevant on the policy committees as well as those final floor votes. But this year, well, the one thing that both caucuses and people do have in common is the theme of one of the legislative themes of enforcement. That seems to be one issue this year that really rose to the top, where we saw the Attorney General even engaged more on legislation and then in previous years, as well as the Housing Department and HCD and their enforcement unit also were much more engaged in policies this year. And even the governor was touting at his press conference how there's already been what they can take credit for. 7,500 new units had been approved because of just administrative action. So I think, again, important to know that the legislative process has this activities going on in the administration over the last few years that have been related to enforcement actions that have been helping developers, and some giving penalizing cities. So it's really important to keep that in mind, that this was going on constantly through the legislative process. So some members maybe had actions and penalties, like the city of Huntington Beach, where the administration was penalizing the city of Huntington Beach, and that again influences their approach when they're looking at legislation. But overall, there was a lot of thematically, a lot of people are very aware, again, members, elected officials are very aware of the housing policy and how their cities feel, how their special districts feel when we're trying to reduce impact fees, and definitely how their counties feel and how their constituents feel. That's always just, again, these housing policies, the votes are very local. Next slide, please. But the constant backdrop that doesn't seem to be changing anytime soon is the fiscal outlook for the state of California. And this year was one of the worst that we've seen in recent history. And unfortunately, the housing budget within the state budget, unfortunately, is not protected by any initiatives like some others are, like education, because of Prop 98. So when there's an area that is at discretion for the state to cut, unfortunately, housing and the housing programs continue to be one of those very vulnerable areas that suffer dramatic cuts because of the dramatic reduction in shortfall that the state experienced this year. So we're going to get into more details on the next slide, but just to keep that in mind. So every bill that was pending before the legislature, a lot of them, even though they were great policies and really was a great public policy, they unfortunately, because the cost of implementing those policies, if they were too expensive, too much work for the Department of Housing and Community Development, or if it required too much state work by its workforce, those bills actually just failed because of the fiscal impacts, because again, this is the constant backdrop we have right now is related to the deep cuts in housing programs. But there was one bright spot at the end of the tunnel, which was AB 1687, that so many of us worked to try to get a state housing bond to pass this year. And unfortunately, that bill never passed, and that the state housing bond did not pass. And instead, thematically, after Proposition 1 on the March ballot did pass, that there was a shift, a real political shift in gears on the fiscal side when it came to housing to not pass a housing bond, and leadership in the governor's office kind of made that decision. And instead, because there was another proposition that was pending going on the state ballot, which was the famous ACA. We have ACA 1 and ACA 13, and we had these competing measures about raising taxes overall, and the thresholds to pass local voter initiatives that were both pending, and again, court decisions also were pending all the way through the month of June. There was just a decision that was made to pull back on that housing bond. The only two state housing bonds that continue to move forward and are going to the ballot to the voters in November was a school bond and a climate bond. And I do like to remind people that school bond hopefully will reduce some, indirectly, the cost of building more housing, because it hopefully gives some relief to schools and school impact fees. But those were the only two bonds that you're seeing on the statewide ballot. And then fortunately, for housing advocates, of course, we see it fortunately, the challenge that was made that the state Supreme Court took up was the California Business Roundtable's ballot initiative was deemed unconstitutional. And that, fortunately, at the last week of June, was pulled from the November ballot and allowed for a green light for ACA 1, which then turned into ACA 10, which was how to make some changes to the original ACA, which now evolved in what you see as Prop 5 is now on the ballot, the statewide ballot, that we'll talk again a little bit more detail on the next slide. But overall, there was this kind of shifting gears of the financial problems for housing, and that the state is out of money, but try to get more tools for the local governments, counties and cities and regions to try to raise those funds directly at the local level from the local voters. So at that time too, until recently, until the summer, there was already a qualification in June that LACASA, which is the Los Angeles County Affordable Housing Solutions Agency, they qualified via Citizens Initiative, which means they collected signatures to qualify that. It wasn't a vote of a governing board, but they collected enough signatures to put a sales tax, a countywide sales tax on the ballot to help fund affordable housing. And then up until late July and early August, there also was going to be a regional bond in the Bay Area, a 9-county regional bond, which has its own challenges when it's 9 counties instead of LACASA, which is 1 county. That bond was moving forward, but unfortunately, due to a lot of different circumstances that many of you may be aware of or maybe not, that bond unfortunately was pulled from the ballot because it did not look like it could pass. And instead, that campaign is now shifted to try to make it easier to pass bonds and reduce that threshold with the passage of Prop 5. So overall, you can just see it was a very complicated year when it comes to the fiscal policy and the budget solutions to try to help, which is the crisis, is try to build more housing. But last but not least, I mentioned LACASA, I mentioned the BAFA initiative in the Bay Area. SB 440 by Nancy Skinner, who you're going to see Senator Skinner in just a little bit. A 2-year bill that she had been working on was, again, an attempt to try to make it a little bit easier for local agencies that need to raise more money to build more affordable housing to do so. So this bill passed, and hopefully it'll make it easier to create those agencies so you don't always have to run a piece of legislation, which is complicated and plagued with a lot of politics. Both CASA and BAFA experienced that. But SB 440 is another new tool that regions and local jurisdictions can get together and hopefully give some more options to try to raise more money that's specific for affordable housing. Next slide. And again, I made a decision not to dive too deep into the housing programs and the budget cuts from this year because my understanding of a lot of you in this audience are very aware of the draconian cuts that were made. Even I can highlight that CalHome was a program, the only program for home ownership, and that program was literally zeroed out of the budget this year and had no money left in it of general funds. But if you look at this chart, it just again shows how draconian the cuts are. Only a couple of programs that were deemed the most essential, productive, and ones that the money is getting out the door the fastest, with the LIHTC program and the MHP program and the REAP program are all ones that were kind of deemed essential and, again, efficient and ways to get that money out the door faster to try to help build new units. So those 3 programs are really the ones that survived the cuts. These other programs all had dramatic reductions, and we're anticipating that similar recommendations are going to come from the governor in January when he announces his January budget. Despite recently, just a week ago, the LAO has some projections that they're a little bit rosier picture in the revenues that have been coming in the fall. There's a 3% increase, which is about a 200 million increase in revenues that have gone up just slightly coming into the fall. I think all of us are hoping and praying that that trend continues, but in election year in November, and the stock market could have experienced some instability. It's uncertain whether or not those capital gains that the state has benefited from in the last couple of months will actually sustain itself through the end of the year, because that is, if you're not familiar with why the state budget had these dramatic ebbs and flows in recent years, it's because it's so reliant on the capital gains taxes and individual income taxes, and that obviously has suffered, and that's why we experienced this dramatic reduction. And if you have any other specific questions on any of these programs and these cuts, I'm happy to answer them later in the Q&A. Next slide. Homelessness programs. If you notice, compared to the previous slide, and I probably should have had them side by side so you could actually see that homelessness continues to be a political issue. It's like the number one still when any elected candidate is polling its electorate to find out what they care about the most in their district. It's still homelessness. It is still number one in polling. It is still the number one thing that people talk about, complain about, is homelessness. So the governor and the legislature continues to fund the homeless programs. Again, there's you see a little bit of reductions, but overall, these programs continue to receive funding, and will continue, I believe, to see funding in next year. And these are programs also, they are committed to trying to get the money out the door quickly. Because of the Proposition 1 passing in March, there's also been a change that the counties the counties and cities and public housing authorities are now, like, I'm excited to see how many are collaborating more and working together more in these applications for more funding. They, again, have a lot of challenges, but it actually is very nice to see finally some more regional collaboration because of, I believe, because of the funding that is coming from the state, and it continues to be a number one priority. It is great to finally see more collaboration at the regional level of getting these funds out the door as quickly as possible, building more units, and hopefully creating, instead of temporary housing, permanent sustainable housing for the homeless and the very low income people in the state of California and throughout the state of California. So again, nice to see that this slide, if you had them side by side, you'd notice dramatic reductions in affordable housing. I say, quote, big A affordable, which is the 80% and to 20% of the AMI and below, but the homelessness programs, fortunately, have not suffered the dramatic cuts that the affordable housing programs have in the last budget year. Next. So I mentioned this earlier. We've got Proposition 2, which is the school bond, and I like to keep it on this list because it's just a nice reminder that housing and new production funds schools and new school construction. So if we're getting, hopefully the school bond passes and more money goes to school, we hope that it'll have an indirect benefit on reducing the cost of construction, because hopefully in those communities, again, that the school impact fees would hopefully go down and help with the overall construction costs. But Proposition 5, that's where most of the affordable housing community, if you're not in LA, is focused on La Casa and that initiative, but most of the affordable housing advocates statewide are laser focused on Proposition 5, which is going to lower the threshold, the voter threshold, to help get public infrastructure and housing, affordable housing, special taxes and bonds passed. And let's hope that happens, because I think most of the polling we saw this year in the Bay Area especially indicated that they could not meet that threshold to get those bonds passed. And it's very challenging in areas, especially some red counties that are very anti-tax and even anti-bond counties, to pass those bonds. So very hopeful that if Proposition 5 does pass, but again, it's still tricky. The Howard Jarvis and the anti-tax payers, they don't have a fully funded and aggressive campaign. At least I don't see it so far in Northern California, and I'm hearing it's not really in Southern California yet either. So far, Proposition 5 has not garnered a lot of attention from the opposition. But if Proposition 5 passes, that will be a game changer in helping the locals pass local bonds to try to help build both infrastructure and affordable housing. And then Proposition 33. That's a proposition that's getting a lot more attention. And some of the commercials and radio ads that I have heard have definitely brought more attention onto Proposition 33 and how it would impact negative, at least the opposition and some of those commercials are really putting it out there that it could impact negatively housing production. Just this morning, I was listening to an informational hearing that the Senate Judiciary Committee was holding on Proposition 33. And just what was reported by the LAO, and I don't think I appreciated as much till I heard the testimony from the LAO, is that it could also impact property taxes and could have a negative impact potentially on property taxes in every region, in every county. And in a post redevelopment world where there's very little funding, if at all, going to help fund housing, let alone affordable housing in local communities, the negative impact potentially in reducing the value of rental properties, which would mean that their property taxes would actually go down. It actually is being keyed as a negative on the fiscal side by the Legislative Analyst's Office because it could really have a negative impact on local jurisdictions' existing revenue. So I think that was just an important thing when I just finished telling you the dire straits that the state fiscal situation has been in the general fund. Local jurisdictions have experienced the same strain of revenues being down, and definitely revenues for affordable housing or housing are practically obsolete at this point in time. But the Proposition 33, which is about rent control and really is just a repeal of Costa-Hawkins, the state prohibition on rent control initiatives to affect buildings that are built after 1995. It is a just straight up repeal of Costa-Hawkins and allows for the local jurisdictions to pass rent control on their own terms. So that's the proposition that you see before you on your ballots. But also, just again, it was important for me to state that fiscal analysis that I just heard this morning, which was a new twist on that initiative that I had not heard from the LAO. And again, just to review, that La Casa bill is actually the La Casa measure in Los Angeles County. Even though La Casa has the right to go to the voters with a bond or even a parcel tax, they work together with the community, with business groups and labor groups and advocates, and decided to go to the voters with a sales tax. So really important, if you didn't know that, it is a sales tax. It's not a parcel tax, and it's countywide. Next slide, please. So that was an overview of the budget process and housing in the budget and the fiscal crisis, but a whole separate legislative process that's going on simultaneously, but on different deadlines, is the traditional legislative process. That's from January to August. They adjourn. The governor had until the end of September to sign the bills, and it was the end of a 2-year legislative cycle. With the election in November, we have a number of new members coming in, but an overview of the themes that I feel like we experienced really over the 2-year cycle, but definitely in this last cycle. These were really the 4 themes that we saw of the bills that got through the legislative process, did not get held up because of their fiscal impacts on the state budget, and then most of which were signed by the governor. And again, I'll highlight a few others that were vetoed. But number one, first and foremost, accountability, transparency, and enforcement. Definitely quite a few bills that were introduced since January, say at least 20, that was trying to maximize density on underutilized properties. That's both private and public properties. So even Surplus Lands Act, I would include into that underutilized properties theme. Also, ongoing commitment from the legislature to try to reduce the cost of construction, impact fees, and other things come up in that under that theme. And then, of course, constantly, I don't think we'll ever see an end to trying to help make sure tenants continue to be protected from displacement, from unjustified rent hikes, as well as unjust cause eviction standards. So we continue to see additional bills, and some bills really cleaning up and fine-tuning existing laws that are on the books to try to help make sure that there's compliance by landlords on the tenant protection laws as well. Next slide. And if you missed it, The governor had a great press conference that had about 6 other legislators that were there as he was signing bills in the Bay Area at a site that's actually a site that is going to be a repurposing of a commercial property to be used for housing. He summed up the bills that he was signing with this quote, which was the state's role is to actually enforce the housing laws and to create market conditions that will facilitate the private sector making investments in communities and building more housing. He actually made an interesting comment and by saying that the cities and counties have the resources, and resources meaning funding. So that was a very important quote. Listening to him say that, I rewound it. I had to listen to it again and I wrote it down. When he said to himself, I might be old school, but I was a mayor and I never looked to Governor Schwarzenegger at that time to help bail me out of my fiscal problems. So I thought it was very interesting of him really, this is a big shift from where he was when he was first elected. Again, the state had a much bigger surplus when he was governor, but really is a shift that I think is an important theme for everyone listening to this presentation, is this real shift to the locals to solve the housing problems, our local problems and community issues that need to be dealt with by the community. But he really just said again that the state's role is to help enforce the laws and help make it easier. And it really just take those barriers away that some cities deliberately continue to create a climate that makes it really hard to build. And it was nice hearing that it's not try not to do a one size fits all approach. Every city is not in the penalty box. He highlighted a few at that press conference, including a local city in my area, Elk Grove, that was refusing to approve a homeless shelter. And his housing accountability unit came down and penalized that city and is making them build a shelter and to find a location. He also, again, reminds us that cities like Huntington Beach continue to defy the state laws, challenge and sue the state to say that their laws are not applicable to them. But he and the Attorney General, who was at that press conference that same day, were both reminding the state how much they're there and that they're going to fight to ensure that some cities who are not doing their fair share of building for the future will continue to be penalized, taken to court, and that their job is that they're committed to enforcing those laws. Next slide. So I'm sure you might have come to this, and if you're listening to me present, you might have had a few other bills that aren't on this list that you may have questions about. So I'm happy to, if I know the answers, I will try to answer them during the Q&A. But these are some of the bills that I felt really rose to the top. They were highlighted at the governor's press conference, and they fit into these individual categories. And these are, again, ones that made it to the governor's desk, even though some of them went through a meat grinder and a lot of changes took place, including this AB 1893, known as the Builder's Remedy, was one of those bills that, again, falls into that enforcement category for cities. And this is only applicable in cities that are not meeting their housing element and have a substantially compliant housing element. Only in those cities that when they fall out of compliance, current applications or new applications for a housing project cannot be denied based on their local zoning standards and requirements. So this was this is a bill I think that got a lot of attention on the Builder's Remedy even a year ago before the bill was introduced, because we had some cities that we had high rises going in, and it was a really interesting I think political dynamic when the bill was first introduced, because you had going into the legislative sessions, you had cities complaining about the existing law being this unlimited, sky's the limit. No, anybody could have proposed anything and they couldn't deny it. So you had a lot of rumblings in cities complaining about Builder's Remedy applications that were going forward that, again, were limitless. And then you had some builders and land use attorneys that were complaining that there was too many ambiguities in the law, that it was a little too risky to propose those applications and not know certainly if they would win in court if they were sued by the city. So Buffy Wicks introduced this bill, and the conversation really launched to a whole new level. The Attorney General of the state of California, Rob Bonta, joined her effort as a sponsor, and agreed that there was too many ambiguities in a law that was over 20 years old, and that they needed to move forward with a law that would maybe balance that unlimited and that negative, where the cities were complaining of unlimited density and unlimited heights, but where they could find a happy medium and also give some more certainty so that applications could move forward and give more certainty when you go to court that a development could actually get finally approved. So that one got a lot of attention. Again, if you're interested in that bill, I encourage you to read the final version of the bill. A lot of changes were made, including at the very end of the bill. So you might want to just take a look at that for the fine details, but it's definitely one to realize that that's going to be one. It's applicable. That's current law today. Builder's remedy applications can toggle. So it's actually theoretically it's declaratory of existing law. So existing applications could reap the benefits of the new builder's remedy after the law becomes effective in January. So again, very important to read those details and familiarize yourself with those if you're in the city planning department and working in a local jurisdiction. 1896 is a David Alvarez bill. I called this the sister or brother, the sibling of 1893. It was dealing with another problem and another legal challenge that developers and cities were finding, and it was a case that went to court in La Cañada Flint Ridge, which is when that light switch that goes on or off of when a city is actually out of compliance with their housing element. One would think that it's like getting a license to drive, that the DMV has to give you the license. You have to take a test and get a license. But there were some cities that were saying, no, we can self-certify. It doesn't matter what HCD says. We can self-certify that we are in substantial compliant. We believe we are. And this law, 1886, actually codifies the judicial decision, which is pretty much no cities can self-certify. Department of Housing and Community Development must take an action and declare that the city has a certified housing element. And it also clarifies when they come in and they come out of compliance so that there's not another lawsuit related to just that action. Of course, there might be challenges to the application, but that was another question that was answered there with the passage of 1886. Again, doesn't become law until January 1st. But a very important one to know of and be aware of if you were also paying attention to 1893. SB 450, another bill that SB 9 got most of the attention 2 years ago, which was the Tony Atkins bill that passed that allows a property owner to split their lot, a single family lot, into two. If they're owner occupied, and in the one side, they can split their lot and build a new unit on the other side and resell it. It was passed and introduced in the spirit of increasing homeownership, as well as you could create a duplex on the single lot if you didn't split your lot. So SB 9 has been on the books for 2 years, and there were some cities that were charter cities that sued and said, nope, we're a charter city. This law does not apply to us. And because of that court action, this legislation, SB 450, clarifies that indeed SB 9 was intended to be applicable in every city, charter or not. So that intent language was modified and went into the final version of 450. In addition, there's some other changes, I would call them tweaks, things that are not that substantive in SB 450, which is why it didn't have any no votes all the way towards the end of the legislative session, because it made some just minor clarifications related to setbacks and heights and design standards. Overall, it made some of that, what we called it, cleanup, but also the most important thing that was added, if you care about the implementation of SB 9, was that change in clarifying that the intent was it was to be applicable in every city in the state of California, not just the non-charters. Next page. We really did have a lot. It reminds me how much we had in the accountability, transparency, and enforcement category. The governor even mentioned when I brought up Elk Grove and I brought up Huntington Beach, that those cities and those communities are getting very familiar with the Housing Accountability Unit and the Attorney General's Enforcement Authority. And with the passage of SB 1037, the Scott Wiener bill, that actually allows the state to add additional fiscal penalties and fines on those cities who continue to defy the state housing laws. So that's, again, another really important bill that passed and very significant to communities that continue to not implement the state laws. Now they can get them with a fiscal penalty, as well as obviously taking them to court and having legal remedies that already exist. So that complements their existing legal remedies. SB 937 and AB 1820. I also consider those siblings. Both of those bills are dealing with impact fees. There continues to be a theme and an appetite by the legislature to try to, again, reduce the cost of construction and especially upfront costs of construction as much as they can to try to help affordable housing projects. And also, both of these bills are applicable to market rate projects as well. That the impact fees on 937, it doesn't mandate that they have to change or they have to be reduced, but it does give a deferral option that they could be paid later. There's a lot of caveats in there. So I encourage you to read the details because there are opportunities for cities and counties and special districts to still get paid under certain circumstances. But overall, for impact fees that are collected up front, and many of which are traditionally not spent until after occupancy, those fees could get deferred. And in the spirit of the deferral, there'd be savings to those projects on the front end and over the life of the project. So that was 937. Get a few other amendments at the end of session. You might want to read the details in the fine print on. AB 1820, again, some of you I think are in city planning departments that are on this call. 1820 also gets clarification that you have to give, and not just existing law says that you need to tell developers how did you formulate impact fees and where do they come from. But in this case, they now have to actually give an assessment and actually give an estimate of what those fees might be. Again, very specific. It's not legally and enforceable if they change over time, but again, helps with that financial certainty and understanding what your costs of your project are. So there's not very many surprises later with an impact fee that they hadn't thought of, or a price of that impact fee that was well over their original estimates. I'm not going to talk too much about 2553, but it just made a very minor modification to impact fees related to transit-oriented projects. It didn't change the fee, but it did change the scope of the projects that are considered transit-oriented by taking the headways from a 15-minute headway to a 20-minute headway. In a post-pandemic world, a lot of the bus stops are not as frequent as they were before the pandemic. So this is really trying to come into speed of what the new transportation patterns are throughout the state of California. So if you are focused on transit-oriented projects, I encourage you to read the fine print on AB 2553. Next slide. I feel like the last couple of years, conversion has been a theme, whether it be single family homes converting to duplexes, commercial housing converting to residential housing. There has just been a theme again on this underutilized properties and trying to maximize densities. So this year we saw that AB 2243 WICS was actually a follow-up to AB 2011 WICS from 2 years ago, made some modifications that are significant, which is it's no longer prohibited near 500 feet of a freeway. And also it changed the acreage for regional mall sites to be eligible to use 2243. There's a few other minor changes and tweaks in there, but those are the most significant. But again, this was all about the governor even made in his comments at his press conference. There were individual cities that were purposely adopting ordinances weeks before AB 2011 passed to try to avoid their city having to implement 2011. And that is what Buffy Wicks, the Attorney General and the governor are just on a mission to try to get ahead of those cities and reacting to those cities and kind of really just, I feel like chasing them. It's like chasing a tail. Every time they run a law, it's like whack-a-mole and trying to just get ahead of those cities that are trying to defy the rules of the law when other cities are embracing them and making it easier to build. There's just some that continue to try to figure out a way to make these state laws not applicable in their cities. And the conversion of commercial to residential is one of them. SB 1123 also is trying to just create more homeownership opportunities and more single family homes or townhomes or condos. It makes the subdivision map act easier and more streamlined. The follow-up to last year's SB 684. Also, ADUs continue to be very popular. in most cities. I can't say every city, but it continues to be politically popular when you call something an ADU instead of a duplex or a new single family home. And because of that popularity, we will continue to see Nancy Skinner is unfortunately leaving the legislature, but I do believe that ADU legacy will continue after she has left the legislature in January. We'll continue to see activity of how to make it easier and to build ADUs everywhere in the state of California. And this year, these two ADU bills are the most important to highlight, which was allowing a multifamily housing project, which is like an apartment or duplex or a fourplex, could add detached ADUs on their property. And SB 1077 allows ADU law to be applicable in the coast without needing to get Coastal Commission approval. Next. And last but not least, by the way, this is not in priority order. Tenant protections are very important. And this is just at the end of the presentation because they weren't as controversial as the legislation I've already highlighted. Because again, these are more cleanup to other bills that have passed, the most significant being in 2018 when the statewide rent cap AB 1482 passed. But that was not applicable on properties that were LIHTC properties and indeed restricted affordable properties. So the bond to bill AB 846 was creating a new standard to have anti-rent gouging policies be applicable to those units as well. Because over the last couple of years, there was demonstration that some tenants that were in deed restricted properties that were used with state tax credits or state funding sources, those tenants were experiencing huge rent hikes. And that's why this bill was targeted that, and our local housing authorities are going to be the ones implementing that at the local level. So again, very important bill that took away that exemption from AB 1482. SB 924 was another one that Senator Bradford is now termed out, but he's continued to work on trying to help tenants improve their consumer reports and their credit reports. And he passed the original bill a few years ago that allowed for their rents to be, if they want to, by the way, optional, but if your rents are on time, to ensure that you can get credit on your credit report. That law passed a few years ago. It was sunsetting, and now SB 924 takes away the sunset and allows it to be a permanent benefit to tenants. Again, if they choose to have that reported, that they can, to improve their credit scores. And then we had the Friedman bill also was focused on landlords who, their shenanigans in getting people's security deposits back. So that was focused on trying to improve that and have more transparency so that folks can actually get all of their deposit back that they're due on repairs and cleaning, to ensure that there's nothing that's purposely created and that's unnecessary to try to get those deposits back. And then I'm not as familiar with this bill, and you're going to be able to ask direct questions of Assemblymember Alex Lee, who's the author, but he definitely increased another loophole. We find these are all cleanups to other bills. A loophole in the eviction, we have a just cause eviction standards that are on the books and law that are in place, but we have landlords that once in a while, try to avoid those laws. And unfortunately, I think it happens more times than not. And therefore, 2304, he can answer more questions with some specific examples, if you're interested, closes some of those loopholes that landlords were taking advantage of to try to evict tenants. So that's just, again, an overview of what I feel like were the bills that got the most attention are significant enough to highlight in this presentation. And I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have about these individual bills. And you can move to the next slide, Ari. Or anything that I've covered so far in this presentation. Obviously, the legislature continues to be extremely busy and focused on many, many themes, but these continue to be some of the strongest themes that in my last 5 years of seeing the legislature being focused on housing policy, these themes continue to come back year after year, and I do believe my prediction and my crystal ball shows that these themes will continue through next year as well in the next legislative session.
Great, thanks so much, Holly. Hi everyone, this is Jacqueline Wu. I am the Legislative Analysis Manager at the Global Policy Leadership Academy. Work closely with Holly to track all this legislation and make sense of it. I'll be moderating the Q&A. So before we kind of get into the questions that have been submitted by the participants, Holly, you mentioned that a lot of these themes are going to be, themes that we'll see next year as well. Any additional sort of forecasts or thoughts about what else we should be looking for in the upcoming session?
I mean, I'm hoping that we'll have some, depending on what happens with these propositions, and I'm hoping again there'll be more money that's on the table to share. But I think thematically, I think we will continue to see we'll see a lot of the same in enforcement and accountability. I think the one that I think only had a little bit I highlighted just briefly was the ADU applicability in the coastal zone. Increasing density in the coastal zone, that continues to come back every year. And I think we've had 2 years running. Senator Alvarez, Assemblymember Alvarez has introduced a bill. He had another bill this year that was trying to make the housing density bonus law applicable in the coast, and that bill died. It had amendments that were forced upon the author in the Natural Resource Committee to try to keep it alive. But sometimes those amendments to try to keep a bill alive actually do more detriment to the status quo. And that was what the sponsors deemed that would maybe do more detriment than the status quo. But I do believe he will be back next year in partnership with Senator Caballero, the chair of the Appropriations Committee that held that bill. They worked together to hold it. And they're both committed to working on that issue and trying to, again, stop some coastal communities that continue to try to avoid building new units in the coast. So I think that's just another overarching theme that will likely surface. I feel like, I hate to say this, but I always tell people there's not a lot of new ideas, but we do bring back and recycle old ideas that have been tried and failed, because that doesn't mean they're bad when they die. A lot of time it's just the political environment, it's the fiscal cost involved. But a lot of bills I think will get recycled, and that is definitely an issue that I think will definitely be coming back next year.
Great. Yeah, and I think that segues into one question that was asked, which was, what is the appetite for taking on the Coastal Commission? Maybe with a climate equity lens. Sounds like there is an appetite for that. But if there's anything else you want to add to that, that would be great.
Well, taking on the Coastal Commission is an interesting even statement, because there are some cities that complain about the Coastal Commission, like city planning and city zoning, city local community, their coastal programs. They have to plan, and they plan for their housing element. But even when the city elected officials, the Coastal Commission's not elected, but elected officials have planned for their own community, it's still subjected to the Coastal Commission's review. So again, there's sometimes the collusion, or can be some shenanigans in passing a local plan that that the Coastal Commission will never approve, or you pass a plan that the Coastal Commission approves, but then individual projects that are compliant with those plans still can't get approval. So I think that's, again, I think it's not necessarily just taking on the Coastal Commission. Those are people names and they change, but it's the process. So I think we'll see more of focus on the process and restoring or giving, I shouldn't say restoring, because Coastal Act's been around for a long time, since the 70s, but like giving more local control to the cities that are planning, the cities that are doing the right thing and are planning to build more, and let that city planning maybe balance more to give more weight to the city than the Coastal Commission, especially if it's a compliant with a proposal and a plan that's been on the books. That's kind of the point, is trying to get, when the city has come up with a plan, ensuring that plan can get implemented to build more housing.
Great, thanks. One other question, shifting gears a little bit, AB 3093 created 2 new arena categories for us to plan for the next cycle: extremely low and acutely low. Do you know of any plan to work with the legislature over the next few years to get support from the state to implement policies that would create those types of units? For example, funds for affordable housing, low barrier navigation centers, emergency shelters, that sort of thing. And I imagine that also coincides with the budget issue.
It definitely does. It's a great question. It came up during the legislative process too, of like, you're creating a new category, and some advocates said, hey, we're creating a great new category for the cities that are already doing this to get credit for it. And then there's others that argued you're creating a new category and we don't have enough money to implement that category. So like, depending on which side you're kind of on, you thought it was a good idea. So I think that is a great question. I think time will tell. It's going to be very important for cities to take notes on, and it's the next cycle, which is still a few years out, but to be really telling the story and capturing the actually what happens and where they've had those challenges. There's more money at the very low and homelessness side coming down. You saw those slides earlier. That category is where there's the most funding right now. And so now at least those units, when they get built with HomeKey, now they will get credit in the RENA cycle, and they didn't before. So hopefully that kind of helps. But to your question and the point that other cities that put in applications and don't get the funding, how are they going to build it? And I just hope the fiscal situation turns around and some regional initiatives get passed. And even for San Diego, I think some minds need to get together of how to try to help get more funding for the region too.
Thanks. Yeah, all really great points, and it really speaks to the need to get more financing and funding. This is another question that I was tracking as well. There were a few bills this year trying to wrestle with corporate buyers of homes, but none of those bills managed to make it through. Can you provide any insight as to why that was?
I could do a whole separate on that. Senator Skinner, I see coming on. She also she can give you more of the political realities of those proposals. And it's a very challenging policy, and it's politically challenging with not just the corporate like buyers, renters, and the flipping, but the realtors, the home building industry association, and those efforts. That is another theme I think will continue. And that one size fits all approach is where I think it ran into some problems, but those issues will not be going away. But it definitely requires a little bit more comprehensive planning and bringing some more stakeholders together. I hope, and like some other coalition partners, in order to have a more successful outcome for those measures.
Yeah, sounds like a pretty nuanced discussion that needs to be had and might take a while.
Yeah.
Here was the other one, reference to Prop 33. Someone was asking you to speak to the pros of Prop 33 and who supports it most.
Who supports it most?
Mm-hmm.
That's a good question. I was just watching the panel this morning of the supporters, and the supporters were tenant advocacy groups. I also saw one of the panelists was a local HERE, I think 1100 down in Los Angeles region, as well as the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. There's a lot of groups, and visit their website if you're looking for details. There's a lot of supporters, as well as a lot of opponents. So I think you can find a lot of information online. And I would just say, and even kind of a piggyback on that last question about the bundling and the sales, and when you're running a policy that blows up a business model, and a business model that also has a government tax scheme that the government benefits from taxing it, it makes things very challenging to run policy. That's and something that can't be changed, because propositions, remember, can't be changed when they're drafted. They can't be amended. They can't be tweaked. The same way AB 1482, the statewide rent cap, that bill was modified many times before it got to the governor, just 2 years ago. So Prop 33 can't be changed. And I think I mentioned it's the repeal of Costa-Hawkins. And if I encourage you to go on the websites to learn more about that. But it definitely, as I said today, and I encourage you to even go on the Senate Judiciary's website and watch that hearing today, because you can hear both sides, and you don't get a lot of opportunities to hear both sides, not just in writing, but actually pitch it to the Senate Judiciary Committee. You heard the supporters and the opponents, even the realtors. Head of Government Affairs was on the panel right before we started. I had to sign off to listen to participate here. I encourage you to watch that, and then you can actually not just hear the names, but actually hear their arguments at both sides and the consequences that both sides will tell you if it passes or if it fails.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of that also happening kind of in my neighborhood as well. And that's a really, really interesting discourse to watch. Any upcoming CEQA or judicial reforms to facilitate housing construction that you are foreseeing for the next session?
It was CEQA or what?
Judicial reforms? That's what I'm seeing. That's what I'm seeing here. Yeah.
It's a good question. I think CEQA and even the Senator Skinner, it continues year after year, and I know the legislators that she's leaving behind will also continue to find areas of CEQA that are still a problem. I think nowadays, if you survey developers, especially affordable developers, I've heard some say CEQA is 100% affordable developers. They're like, we've got an exemption that covers us. It's not necessarily the CEQA review that's their problem, but it's the challenges and the litigation and the lawsuits that are more of their problem, as them getting sued. It's not the compliance with, it's the lawsuits, unlimited, relentless lawsuits that are more of the problem. So I think there's been a shift, a few bills that we've worked on in recent years to expedite a judicial hearing, so you don't get caught up in court for 2 years, that you can get an answer sooner rather than later. But there's exceptions to the exceptions. And unfortunately, that's kind of the problems that we see with CEQA. But I think every year I've worked on a bill related to CEQA and housing, and it's kind of just chipping away at it. But I think both developers, 100% affordable, and your market rate folks, especially infill developers, have said it's the litigation, the lawsuits that remain. And that's why the second part of your question about judicial review and judicial counsel, I think you for sure will continue to see the work that they'll continue to do in that regard.
Yeah, for sure.
Especially, again, expediting and streamlining judicial review, because we've got a lot of legislation that has expedited the permitting process, the local review process, the design process, but then you get stuck in court under CEQA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you get tied up with all sorts of different things.
Tied up.
Okay, moving on to the ballot initiatives. Someone asked if we can get elaboration on if Proposition 5 would affect Proposition 13. Which I think is the Chris Ward proposition that was introduced to counter the.
It doesn't affect Proposition 5. The propositions are mutually exclusive, but the Proposition 13, I'm like, you've got my numbers right. It does impact. It makes it harder to pass the bill that the initiative that the court threw out, the roundtables bill. It impacts a future initiative that would try to increase the thresholds. So they are the Proposition 5 is not impacted by any other initiative. It does stand on its own. At least that's my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, and it's very that whole Proposition 13 and the business roundtable situation was
because the Ward initiative was meant to counter the roundtable initiative, but then the roundtable initiative was thrown out by the court. Fortunately,
and the Ward initiative is not on the ballot this time around either.
Right.
Okay, thanks for that. Have there been any discussions around expanding use of state funds to the acquisition of, I guess, existing housing, not just new construction?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, SB 225, which was a Caballero bill that I don't think we didn't highlight today, but it's definitely preservation is a very important issue. And there was an attempt to get more money and create a new new bucket of dollars for preservation. So even though there's no money, we're in a really bad year to try to get new funding for preservation. But there also are, even Cal Home had funding for preservation in it. That preservation is a very important issue. And I think cities and counties and even the state are looking at it as a cheaper way sometimes to try to preserve units and keep low-income people in their single-family homes so they don't lose them because they can't afford to maintain them. And also the aging stock. A lot of landlords that use vouchers, they have units that they can't afford to maintain and upgrade. And so again, it's a really important issue. And I think we will continue to see the state prioritize it when there's a little bit more money. But when there's no money, it makes it harder. And they're also in this desperate crisis to try to get new construction. So it's really challenging when there's no money. But I hope we'll see more on the preservation side. If and when, I know I shouldn't say if, it will turn around. We just don't know how many more years it will be before we see a surplus again, especially a historic surplus as we have in recent years. but it will turn around. It comes back eventually.
Yeah, yeah. And to your point earlier about, their forecast that California it will do better next year. So it's just a matter of, how much better and how long it'll take.
We just need it in the billions and not just in millions. We need it in the billions.
Last question, we have 1 minute. In reference to the November ballot, are there any local officials that are more sympathetic to these housing issues? I think we've mentioned a number of them, but you feel free to go ahead and, yeah, it looks like it's locals. So I guess the San Diego region.
Locals in the San Diego region, I think your mayor continues to be very pro-housing. Every time I land there and I'm driving around downtown, I am so impressed with how much new housing construction. I'm shocked that the rents downtown are still pretty high considering how much is being built. But I think it just depends on the region. Your region continues to have that reputation of pro-housing. When you look at electeds, that the big mayors, the Big 10 mayors across the state sound like they're still very pro-housing. Mayor Bass in Los Angeles sounds like and always looks like very pro-housing, but even recently has changed an initiative, an ordinance that she had on the books when she got there related to increasing development in single-family neighborhoods. So I think, yes, I've never met an elected official, local or state, that says they're not pro-housing. I've never met one. They all say they are. It's their ideas of how to address the crisis and the problem. They disagree on the solutions. So like when you ask somebody, you ask me, my opinion might be different than yours. We might both say, hey, someone's pro-housing, or no, they're not, because you disagree on the solutions. I think it really depends. But fortunately, in my 20 years, and especially the last 12 working on housing, I'm proud that every elected official and person on the ballot is telling me that housing is like one of their top priorities, housing and homelessness. So fortunately, they care about it and they want to address the crisis. But our job is to try to help them bring solutions of how to, because the how to is where it's very challenging. And the governor always mentions it's been over 100 bills that he's signed since he came to office that have to do with housing. And the two individuals to Senator Skinner and Assemblymember Lee are going to speak to some of the specifics. And Nancy Skinner's unfortunately has termed out, but we're still in a crisis. And there's so many bills that we have passed and so many things that we've done. But it's still, we're just not even close to what some of the other states in our nation are able to just build faster and smarter than we are. So we're still in a crisis and still a lot of work to be done.
Great. Thank you so much, Holly. Really appreciate all your insights. I think this has been a very thorough and, engaging conversation and set of information that you provided. So really appreciate that. I am going to turn this over to Natalie Donlan-Zappella, who is going to be the moderator for the upcoming panel, and let her take it away. And Holly and I are going to stay on to respond to any of the questions that we didn't get to during this Q&A.
Thank you so much, Jack and Holly. Appreciate that insight. Laid a great foundation for our panel discussion today. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists for today's discussion. I'd like to first introduce Senator Nancy Skinner from Berkeley, who is chair of the Senate Housing Committee and has served in the California legislature for 14 years, 8 years in the Senate and 6 in the Assembly. During her tenure at the state capitol, Senator Skinner has authored laws to prevent local governments from denying housing projects that conform to existing rules, while also speeding up the permitting process for housing that already meets local zoning and barring down zoning. She has also authored laws to build more housing for college students, prevent hedge funds from gobbling up foreclosed homes, and spur the creation of more accessory dwelling units. As past chair of the Senate Budget Committee, Senator Skinner has also successfully advocated for the state budget to include more than $30 billion to help address California's homelessness crisis and its shortage of affordable housing and college student housing. Assemblymember Alex Lee will also be joining us. He represents California's 24th Assembly District of the Bay Area. Assemblymember Lee was elected in 2020, and he currently serves as chair of the Committee on Human Services, the Select Committee on Social Housing, and the Legislative Progressive Caucus. In his first year in office, Assemblymember Lee was named Legislator of the Year by the Golden State Manufactured Homeowners League, as well as the California Attorneys for Criminal Justice. He also received the up-and-coming award from the Building the California Dream Alliance. Previously, he's worked on statewide policy regarding public safety, climate change, and education for California State Senator Henry Stern and Assemblymember Evan Lowe. We will also have Stephen Russell joining us. Stephen is the president and CEO of the San Diego Housing Federation. He brings with him a nearly 30-year history working in community and economic development in the Mid-City region of San Diego. He served as executive director of the El Cajon Boulevard Business Improvement District, where he was responsible for implementing an economic development strategy for an aging commercial district. He later served as an advisor to then San Diego City Council member Tony Atkins on issues related to redevelopment, infrastructure financing, small business support, and the city's general plan. Stephen is currently a board member of Civic San Diego, Housing California, and the California Housing Finance Agency, also known as Cal HFA. Prior to joining the Federation as its president and CEO, Stephen was a member of the firm Platt and Whiteclaw Architects, a full-service architecture firm specializing in sustainable design. Next, we have Vino Pahanor. Vino, with a background in law and nonprofit leadership, has been serving as CEO of Catholic Charities since October 2018. Drawing on his extensive experience in nonprofit work and real estate development to oversee the organization's programs in San Diego and Imperial counties. With a nonprofit heart and a for-profit mind, as Vino describes it, he connects deeply with the mission of Catholic Charities by ensuring the agency has robust financials with a triple bottom line framework, SMART goals, and organizational means to live out its calling with excellence. Thank you for joining us today, panelists. We're excited to dive into this. What I'd like to do is begin with you, Assemblymember Lee. Thank you for joining us today. Over the last few years, you've made a splash in the legislature with your bills to move forward an agenda on social housing. Your bill this session, AB 2881, would have created the California Housing Authority, an organization whose mission would be to produce and preserve affordable housing. Can you please share your vision and inspiration for this concept and outline the political and social barriers that have prevented progress? How have your trips to Vienna and Singapore shaped your vision?
Yeah, well, good afternoon, everyone. Really pleased to be here. So as you heard from all the exhaustive framing of all our great speakers, I, as well as Senator Skinner, have had the pleasure and opportunity of going to places like Vienna, like Singapore, to study social housing. If you haven't heard of social housing before, it is something that I proselytize all the time about, but it's really important that we adopt a tool that many countries in Asia and Europe have already implemented to produce their own affordable housing. That is to have the government have a role in the direct provision and production of affordable housing, and really using the Singaporean and Viennese models. We see different flavors, different varieties of it. It really comes down to the government being the driver's seat of producing affordable housing, just like every other public infrastructure like schools and roads and etc. that their residents depend upon. That's what we want to bring to scale to California. Now, in the Viennese and the Singaporean models, they talk about really great renter conditions, or in the Singaporean model, you can have home ownership. But the idea is really that we don't put all our eggs in the private market, is that the government has to also have its role in the provision of housing as well, and building out mixed income, beautiful, sustainable housing that's for everyone. And that's the kind of vision we're trying to bring here in a very, very condensed nutshell. I'm sure we'll have more questions about it, but the idea is that the state of California would create a social housing developer to assist localities, whether they cities, counties, or even school districts, using that public land to create affordable housing for all its residents. You see different smaller iterations of this in America, whether it be in Seattle, who are now creating their social housing developer, Montgomery County in Maryland, which is actually doing this. And actually more recently too, there's federal social housing legislation that was introduced by Representative AOC and Senator Tina Smith of Minnesota. So this idea is catching on, and it's really something for us to follow in the footsteps of many other countries. And I'm sure we'll have more opportunity and questions about that. But really wanted to share that, there are many variety of issues out there, or very many solutions out there. And one that's really underutilized in America is social housing, but you're seeing municipalities really step up to it.
Thank you so much, Assemblymember. Would like to transition now to you, Senator Skinner. You also had the chance to go to Vienna, as we just heard from Assemblymember Lee. You've also had a lot of accomplishments in the legislature, especially as it relates to housing and land use policy. So with so many progressive bills coming on themes such as streamlining and housing accountability and even social housing, as we just heard, can you help set the stage for where we were on housing 10 years ago and how we got to where we are today?
Certainly. Well, I'll set it for when I first got in the legislature, which was 2008, and in the depths of the housing foreclosure crisis and the Great Recession. California was already in a housing crisis. We had already been for decades not building enough units, considering our population increases. And then we had, the foreclosure crisis occur, and we had corporate entities buying up single-family homes and turning single-family homes into an asset class of renting. But they didn't always rent all of them, so they left properties vacant and further hurt our housing crisis. And then we also had just a complete, there was, while interest rates were low, there was no capital available to developers, to contractors. So a huge number of people in the construction fields left that business. We're still in a shortage of construction workers. And of course, there just were no housing starts being built. So, that we faced this already housing crisis being amplified by all of those factors. And of course, the state not in a position to provide subsidies for affordable housing, which, as we know, is the way affordable housing is built. Affordable housing is built either because the local governments give something extra to the private market developer, who then is able to finance the affordable housing because they can make the other housing they're building in the project, it pencils out, or it is government subsidies. So anyway, so that's what we were facing. And my initial legislation facing that kind of thing were things to protect homeowners, to try to stop this corporate buy-up of single-family homes, which is the kind of bills I was carrying in the assembly, and then to lift parking requirements, because I realized that we really needed to make it more affordable, even for a market rate developer to build. And California had these absurd requirements for parking spots for each unit, multiple parking spots in some cases. And as we know, the addition of parking can add tens of thousands to 100,000 to the cost per unit, depending on the configuration and such. So those were the kind of bills I was trying to do while I was in the assembly. And those were the main ways that we were sort of confronting local control. There weren't really many other bills during that period of time, basically squarely looking at the fact that it was our local governments, either their zoning policies or their own processes for approval, that were stopping a lot of projects. And partly, I think you didn't see a lot of legislation in that time period in those areas because there weren't projects to disapprove. There just weren't projects. So we were really just trying to create a better atmosphere for projects to go forward. And then, of course, as time went on and we realized, all right, so now the economy's better, developers want to start building again, and not just developers, anybody, right? Even a homeowner, wants to add on. And we had to confront the fact that our local government's own rules were preventing them from doing so, or prolonging, making the decision stretch out for so long that it was no longer feasible to do the project. And that was especially terrible for affordable housing projects. That would stretch out 10, 15 years before you got the approval, which of course then made it completely unaffordable. And that's really when the legislature started confronting, hey, we're going to have to just begin to overturn local control. There wasn't a lot of appetite by some legislators. They really, there is this, not only in California, but I think across the country, this kind of respect, well, that's really a locality's decision. But we really had to accept that, sorry, this is a statewide crisis. Our localities, by and large, are not stepping up to the plate, and we have to, in effect, require them to. We have to remove the obstacles.
Thank you for that rundown. So interesting to hear it from your perspective, going through it. What would you say are the bills that you helped lead on that are still having a big impact today?
Sure. Well, those early bills to try to minimize the parking requirements, I couldn't even get him out of committee. So thankfully, Assemblymember Friedman took up that charge, as well as have some others. Others have sort of built it into bills that really were about something else, but they kind of snuck it in. Whereas Assemblymember Friedman went straight head on, like, no, remove these ridiculous parking requirements. So she sort of took over that mantle. But in terms of bills that I specifically carried that have really been game changer bills, SB 330, the Housing Crisis Act from 2019. I watched my colleagues very brilliantly, Senator Wiener, others, put forward bills to increase density. Now, before I was in the legislature, many years ago, I was a Berkeley City Council member. Now, you got to remember, Berkeley is the home, or not home, it's the origin really of NIMBYs. Berkeley is the jurisdiction that created zoning and created exclusionary zoning at the turn of the century. And interestingly enough, that exclusionary zoning was to prevent Asian immigrants and Asian Americans from being able to buy houses. It wasn't African Americans because there weren't that many Black residents in the East Bay at the time. That came later. But anyway, we'll leave that alone. But here I represent the place that had brought NIMBYism to a fine art. And so anyway, I watched my colleagues try to do bills that would require an increase in density. And I saw them really hitting up against brick walls. And so I thought, okay, we as a state, we had our housing accountability law. It didn't have good enough teeth. It didn't have good enough enforcement powers, but we had one. And we had the expectation on all regional entities. And part of this was a bill from former pro tem Darrell Steinberg, where every regional entity, the plan, like an MTC or an ABAG in my area, and I guess it would be SANDAG in your area, had to make a determination of what's the housing need in this region. And so within 10 years, we need X more units of housing, and then assign a number to each jurisdiction that you are responsible for this percent of these or X number of these. So we saw at that point, now we're talking, this is now 2016 on, we saw local governments adopt plans to say, okay, we're going to have to build that much more housing. And they adopted plans and they did some rezoning, but we didn't see any projects getting approved. So I'm like, what's that about? So I sat down with some planners and some other friends, and I'm like, okay, what can we do now that we've put all this stuff into place? We know the local governments have zoned for these more units and set up supposedly the processes for them. Why aren't we getting anywhere? Well, of course, what was it? Because there were so many steps in the process where either the residents could say no, or a zoning approval board could say no, or the city council itself could say no, and without really a strong basis. So I thought, okay, we're just going to do the Housing Crisis Act, where we're going to take the simple concept. If you are submitting an application that meets the local government's rules, that meets the zoning rules and the planning requirements that the local government has already set into code or however, and then the local government basically has to say yes. It didn't eliminate the public process. It just limited the number of public hearings. And it still allowed for design review and for some other negotiations around, certain aspects of the design or placement on a lot, what have you, right? But not such where in the midst of the process, all of a sudden, either the local government or the zoning board could change the rules and say, oh, yeah, this parcel was zoned for this, but now we're going to let you only do this much. Or this parcel was zoned, with this kind of setback, but now we're going to double it. So basically, 330 had this simple concept. If you're playing by the rules, the local government has to facilitate you and process it in a certain time period. And if they don't, then you have the right to sue them under the Housing Accountability Act, and there's penalties. So that's what SB 330 did, and it's still going. And it's got a sunset date, however, of 2029. So Alex, you'll have to think about that. And if it's still useful, which I think it will be, continue it.
Thank you so much. Stephen, turning to you now, there have been a lot of land use bills that have been passed in recent years, which are supportive of affordable housing production. Which do you see to be most impactful, and what other major barriers to affordable housing production and operations still need to be addressed?
Thank you for that question. First of all, thank you for having me here today. And I'm really honored to be here with Assemblymember Lee. And Senator, you are just a hero to folks in our sector here. And so I want to crow a little bit about what we've done with the laws you helped pass, both of you, which is San Diego, we're really proud of the city, has gone well beyond the minimum standards for the density bonus. We've done complete communities. We've done other programs that have exceeded what the state has told us we need to do. And we have a great mayor in Todd Gloria who has implemented these and has helped us take them to the maximum effect. And what the result is, I live in a very small, I've lived since I was 20 in a 2-mile radius of Texas and El Cajon. I've seen the change. I mean, it was part of my daily life, seeing the change, the amount of housing that's coming on board, the fact that rents are settling, that specials are being off, move-in specials are being offered. Those are real market indicators that these things are having an effect. At the same time, I just went to PB this weekend and I was stunned. I don't spend much time there. How short PB is, how white PB is, and how wealthy PB is. And so you have very exclusionary policies through the Coastal Commission that prevent it from actually housing the folks who were serving me dinner that night, from running the beachfront shops. It was just even the lifeguards can't afford to live there, right? So we have public servants, the police, the fire. So I look at what bills have made a big difference. The density bonus has been huge. And we have just recently passed, we were sponsors of the bill, SB 713, Mr. Padilla's first bill, that actually made clear that state law density bonus superseded the local height limits in the coastal zone. So that was something we see as significant and kind of a first indicator that this is a direction we need to go because we have completely untapped potential in these coastal areas. Clearly the resources are something that we really need to make housing work. Affordable housing does not finance itself. That is the oldest truism in the book. And so there's several aspects of that. One of which is with homelessness, which is the failure of the housing market. Essentially, we are still not subsidizing at the level we need to. We need operating subsidies, that is vouchers, to ever reach the number of units that we really need in this region. And furthermore, we have to talk about PSH. We need to create categories of simply very low income housing for people who aren't that traumatized, for people who haven't spent a couple of years on the streets, who are just poor and need a low rent. The SROs that existed here used to be really a way of accommodating that. And maybe we need to figure out legislation that helps us create more SROs, maybe more boarding houses. We've lost rungs on the housing ladder that we need to replace. I think if we, looking back, we haven't been dealing with insurance all that much in the past. It is now staring us in the face. If we can't get control on the cost of insurance, I can promise you what happened with Skid Row Trust will happen in other places. So we need to be mindful of how do we create a program. I'm obviously concerned for affordable housing. It is all housing that is going to be impacted by this. And furthermore, beyond just housing, all of us as individuals, if we can't get on the insurance bandwagon. So, I mean, that's the good and the bad. The laws we've been given, I think we've used the zero parking. We see examples of buildings that have come in with zero parking. Some of them have had to rent parking nearby. That's perfect. That's perfect because now you're letting the market respond and you're letting people make choices, and buildings are being built that would never otherwise be built. I could go on, but I think, those are kind of the key themes, is that the legislation coming out of California has been incredibly powerful, very impactful. I'm a little concerned what might happen with RENA. I realize there's discussions locally about maybe trying to change the formula or the approach. We're going to watch these things carefully, because we think RENA has been an important point on the wall that we can calibrate other programs to, that we can hold people accountable for, and we want to make sure that RENA stays strong. The last thing I'll say is Surplus Lands Act was very impactful. The County of San Diego has been extraordinary in providing sites that were well located in urban areas next to services. I think the Mount Etna complex in particular is one that is especially good. Levant Street Cottages, also in the Linda Vista area, projects that are possible only because the land was provided at very nominal rates. So the Surplus Lands Act that has been defended year after year, it's under attack every year. I thank the folks on the panel here for helping protect that for us, because it has been an incredibly powerful tool.
Thanks so much, Stephen. I really appreciate that. And you also highlighting kind of some of the issues that still need to be addressed, and some of the barriers that are facing the industry. Vino, great to hear from you about one of the biggest pieces of legislation that's been passed in recent years, SB4, which allows for housing on faith-based and private education land. Could you share a little bit more about how your organization, Catholic Charities, is leveraging this legislation to create housing on your land, and what barriers you're still facing to efficiently develop on your land?
Thank you, Natalie. And thank you for having me over here. Thanks to Senator and Assembly Member for the work that you have done, continue to do, for ensuring that it's housing for all. Stephen, for all the work that you do here with our affordable housing teams and developers here. I'm representing the faith-based entities, right? So the voice is coming for, but I am associated with the Catholic Church. Before I get into this AB4, just to get everybody's bearings right, the Turner Center did a report, an updated report in August of 2023, and they've identified about close to a little over 47,000 acres across the state of California that potentially developable land that's owned by faith-based organizations. Just in San Diego alone, there's about 4,000 acres just owned by faith-based entities. And I belong to one of those, which is the Catholic Church. I'm the social arm of the Catholic Church here in the Diocese of San Diego, between San Diego and Imperial County, and we own quite a few of them. SB4 is a great first start. I'm speaking on behalf of the Catholic Church's perspective, and so I'm going to limit myself to that. And why am I saying that is there's a lot of parcels, there's a lot of possibilities within the Catholic Church where there is land that can be brought in to be redeveloped. These are parking lots, these are schools that are closed down. There are other parcels within the Catholic Church here. But we as a Catholic Church, as a Catholic organization, are not in the business of building housing. And one of the things that I see that we as a church, we as something needs to happen is a capacity building locally to ensure that our church-based entities have the capacity to take advantage of these legislations and these regulations that are coming down the pipe, because we are not equipped to that level. So that's the first one. The second one is that if you've seen one Catholic church, you've seen one Catholic church, whether it is in South Bay, next to San Isidro, or somewhere in La Jolla, out on the coast. There are local needs. And one of those local needs in the churches is that they are operating churches. And just to, for us all, Catholic Church is a growing organization right now because all of the influx of migrants and others and immigrants that are coming in, the Catholic Church is growing in San Diego region. And there's also a cross-border region. So the church also needs its land for its own use. So AB4 has great things in it, but has some limitations for the church as such to bring that land in to be used for affordable housing, middle income housing, and mixed use. So we have to look at AB4 and say, hey, this is a great first shot at it. What can we do to make sure that there is that local church need that is also addressed. Because if these pastors who are there at these Catholic churches are not seeing that they could get 50% of their property gone for parking or whatever it might be they're needing for weekends, and they don't have that use, they're going to pull back. So we have to figure out how we can work with the local active church that is there and still ensure that it is meeting the needs of affordable housing, mixed income or middle income, and others. As I said earlier, we are in the business of bringing faith into people and creating faith in action. That's what Catholic Church is here for. Therefore, that we don't have the sophistication of how to get it financed, if any development that happens. So how do we look at it and saying already there's a lot of competition with light tech or the tax credits and other things that are happening? When agencies, faith-based organizations are involved in that realm, what are other financing mechanisms that can come in and can mesh along with the local needs of the church? Specifically, there is this law that we are all abiding by as citizens of the United States and in California, but then there is this canon law that the church has to abide by, which is in the canonical side. They have to abide by it. They have restrictions on it and others. How can you blend that together and ensure that the financing and other mechanisms can work and ensure that it's a win-win and we can create housing for all? So that's where I see AB4 is a great start, but we need to make sure that we can work on it to ensure like entities or faith-based organizations like Catholic Church is able to bring those properties in that is favorable and good for the community as well as for the church.
Thank you. Highlighted a lot there. Really interesting to hear you break it down like that. You know, technical assistance, capacity building is an issue across the industry, and the financing issues, you know, that are, you know, appearing for you with canon law and your responsibilities as a citizen. We're covering a lot of bases here. Senator Skinner, back to you. In about 1 minute, could you share a little bit more about, you know, there seems to be some headwinds to housing production at the state level. You've worked on legislation about impact fees and inclusionary fees. How do you think we can balance policies like these that are also important local sources of funding for planning departments, infrastructure, and affordable housing in about 1 minute?
Okay, so Prop 13 is always the, seems like a, what do you call it, elephant in the room. Prop 13 has really hurt local governments. They put a lot of these extra fees on things because they aren't able to generate the revenue they need to provide the services to residents. And unfortunately, if you put those type of fees on housing, you don't get housing built. So, and there's so many of them, whether it's the impact fees or just the cost of processing the permit, or in the case of utilities, whether it's a water utility, a sewer utility, whichever, those fees are huge. I'll just give an example. My water utility in my area, I built an ADU in my backyard. Had I wanted to rent that, it's for a family member, so I wasn't going to rent it. But had I wanted to rent it, and if I put in a new meter, not using my meter, they charged me for an ADU $38,000. So it didn't matter if my ADU is 150 square feet or 800 square feet. It was going to be $38,000 for that meter. So those kinds of costs are really impeding our housing. And then, of course, you've got school fees, library fees, meaning because the local government is going to offer that service. So it's not that I think any of those fees in and of themselves are bad, but collectively, they are hurting housing. And so we have to figure out a way for local governments to be able to afford to do the business they need to do without putting it on the backs of housing.
Great, thank you. Turning to you, I want to, kind of build off the fees issue and lowering cost, but look a little bit more deeply at tenant protections. So Stephen, one of the tenant protection bills that might have had a big impact on your constituents, the affordable housing industry, was AB 846, which imposes rent increase limits for light tech projects. what would this mean practically for the affordable housing providers and systemic implications that you see, if any?
This is a really hard one because the mission of our affordable housing developers is to provide housing, stable housing, where people can live either a good stretch of their lives or perhaps for the rest of their lives. And most of our populations who are seniors, a lot of folks who are disabled, have fixed incomes. And so those fixed incomes don't rise anywhere near what inflation does. On the flip side, you know, I speak even from experience, like running as the board chair of the City Heights Community Development Corporation before the last recession. We had a policy of like, we're going to keep the lowest rents we possibly can. And year after year after year, we ended up with huge amounts of deferred maintenance. It almost brought the organization down. So there's a balance that has to be struck. So the practical impact is these projects have been underwritten by banks with certain assumptions in place. Those assumptions have been constrained. I think what's interesting is that, of course, it is the rising incomes on the high end that are actually driving up the AMI and therefore the ability to raise rents. So we have maybe a flawed mechanism in the first place for what were allowable rents. Capping them and not having predictability is going to be challenging because we are asked to do so many things in the affordable housing sector, not just actually providing a low-income place, but the resident services. We have exceptional maintenance standards because we have to maintain our properties to the highest possible standards. So there's some real challenges on some properties with that. It depends on how they're underwritten. What is the AMI range that we're looking at? It remains to be seen what the implementation will look like, but we certainly know that there's been, you know, some sticker shock sometimes when somebody has kept rents low artificially for a long time, goes to resyndicate in order to actually improve the property. The banks then require them to go up to fairly, you know, current rent levels in order to finance the project. So you have truly competing interests here. I think some of it is just that can we not get some more operating subsidy into this affordable housing? We are really committed to keeping it affordable. We need to subsidize either through a voucher program or some other mechanism so that these rent increases can be avoided without threatening the integrity, the physical and financial integrity of these buildings.
Yeah, well said. There's been a lot of discussion about the need for more operating subsidies in the industry. You highlighted that really well. Thank you. Sticking on tenant protection bills, I wanted to turn to you, Assemblymember Lee. We covered today AB 2304, which ensures that tenants are not unfairly penalized on rental applications if they have won their civil eviction cases, which closes a disclosure loophole. Can you share more about what this would mean for tenants and what other tenant protection issues you're thinking of focusing on next year in about a minute?
Yeah, of course. Just quickly to say is that, you know, the bill ended up being amended through the process, and now it extends these protections to mobile home owners who are, of course, renting their plot of land. So basically what happens in eviction court now is that what we're trying to do is that if you were sued allegedly for damages that were under $10,000 and you won, of course, that's not going to be reflective on your record, right? So especially if you think about a traditional tenant who rents a traditional tenancy, that could have a lot of implications for them. What we tried to do first, Bill, was actually for eviction court where they were sued for more than $10,000 of damage. And again, that was the allegation. What we wanted to do was mass those records of people who were victorious in court. So say you went to eviction court, your landlord said you blew up the house, and of course you didn't blow up the house and you won. But current law still says today that, you know, if you were asked on a tenancy application, have you been to eviction court? You have to, of course, say, well, yeah, of course I've been there, but I won, right? And you have to, now you're on the back foot. That bill, unfortunately, was amended. So we do want to revisit that in later time where it is a matter of process, and a lot of Democrats, unfortunately, were not so comfortable with changing this process. But, you know, I do believe that if a tenant goes to court and they're victorious in court, that shouldn't be a black stain on them because they were victorious, right? And so that was one of the really tough things. And just a quick aside too is Senator Skinner and I and Assemblymember Ward, we all worked on legislation about corporate land. I know this came up in the previous one about corporate landlording in the single family home market. We were not successful this year, but it is an issue that we are passionate about and will continue to work on, whether it be in new construction or existing construction. Just know that for the people listening, this is something we are still working on too.
Great, thank you. Vino, turning to you and, keeping with the focus on tenants themselves, one of the things that sets you apart as a faith-based organization is that you focus not just on the housing ecosystem now with new legislation, but you're really interested in putting more than just a roof over people's heads and really thinking about the whole person and their needs. Could you share for all of us how your priorities are different and how does that impact how the kind of faith-based sector is approaching development and operation?
You can build a house, but you need to build a home. And when you build a home, the home is just not there for those individuals living in it, but the community that surrounds it. Catholic Charities is a service provider that has food pantries, has services for women and for children and for families and everybody in between, right? And so when we look at development within the Catholic Church, we are looking at these parking lots or these schools converted to more housing units. But then providing these wraparound services, that is a community center where services are there for food pantry or others, budgeting, making sure that people are sustaining it themselves. And more importantly, that the church that is nearby is just not another building next door, but the community that is there is wrapping itself around the people living in these homes so that they are supporting these individuals to grow and achieve what they need to achieve. Because if you don't bring the community aspect of it, it just becomes a housing unit next to a church. And that's not what we want to do, in which we want to build these housing units that are next to a church, but build that community that supports it and ensure that these individuals that are calling themselves homes in those affordable units or middle income units are not looked down upon, that they are part and parcel of that community, and there's this togetherness so that we can build neighborhoods that are sustaining and developing themselves instead of somebody else coming and having the savior effect on local neighborhoods. That's what our vision is for Catholic Charities.
Thank you. I love it. So we're going to transition now to Q&A from the audience. And this one's for all of you who would like to share. Would love to hear, we've talked, already in this discussion about the need for operating subsidies, the capacity building that's needed in the industry, which cuts across different sectors that are, now coming more into housing. But the housing sector is just, really stripped and at its wit's end. People are burning out and there's not a huge pipeline. You've also talked about, in preparation for this panel, the need for more home ownership programs and opportunities for tenants to build equity and have that kind of equitable process recognized like homeowners have. So what do you see as the largest remaining barriers to housing, given the long list of bills that have been passed over the last few years? And what are some of the priorities that you see moving forward for affordable housing?
I'd like to
Well, a bill that the governor signed into law that I carried this year, which I think will be helpful to some regions, is SB 440, which allows for local governments in a region to come together and form joint powers authorities to be regional housing finance agencies. So the LA has one, Bay Area has one, but it used to be that state law, you had to go to the legislature and get a one-off if your region wanted to create one. So my SB 440 basically opens the door to any region, and they have to still follow local rules, but it allows them to come together and create a regional housing finance authority where they can pull together their expertise to provide, say, assistance to faith-based entities in their area and do some measures that either bonds or other things that might create some ability to finance and partner together to create affordable housing. So that one is a good one, and I hope that my colleagues, as time goes on, if it needs some tweaks or improvements, do that, since I will be termed out this year.
Stephen?
Yeah, so I want to touch on the ownership and equity issue. And as an affordable housing advocate, people sometimes surprised, but we know that a lot of our residents are stuck in the places they're living because there is no next rung on the ladder. We need to fill in that middle income affordability, ownership opportunities. And when we look at San Diego, and those of you who know San Diego, Mira Mesa, we need about 100,000 middle income home ownership opportunities, middle and upper. That would equate to 4 Mira Mesas if we build them as single family homes. And you cannot imagine we could build, there's not even one Mira Mesa left here. Suburban scale density for those who don't know San Diego. We need to build multifamily. So we have the need for ownership, we have the need for multifamily. We've got to look at what are the barriers to actually producing multifamily infill. And those include construction defect litigation. They include a whole host of laws around HOAs. They include the insurance issues, subdivision map act streamlining, so it can be a ministerial rather than a discretionary action. Those are just, and lot size, minimum lot sizes, bringing down minimum lot sizes so that it is easier to subdivide parcels where it might have a single family home where you might be able to get 5 row homes, for instance, very easily in much of the region. Those are things we need to be doing for home ownership and to build equity. And that it doesn't even get into limited equity cooperatives and other forms of ownership or equity participation that we could facilitate.
Yeah, thank you. I love that you brought up insurance again. Vino, jump in.
I want to tag along with what Stephen had just mentioned. It's really just like in the homelessness system, that's the continuum of care. You have to have a continuum of housing, which includes the unsheltered, the sheltered, those who are going from the shelters to supportive housing or affordable housing, or those, and then getting into middle income and then getting market rate. We need to have a better coordination and cooperation and a synchronization among all levels, both for-profits and non-profits and government and others, to create that continuum. Because if we have to move people either within the same generation or another generation, the subsequent generation, to build those assets, we need to move them through the pipeline of housing and figure out how we are very methodically doing it. Not just saying, okay, we're going to throw you into this affordable housing unit and then that's it. Look at, okay, how can we move them along? And that's where I'm glad that Senator and Assembly Member visited Singapore and Vienna, how we can bring the social mixing into our realm, that we don't say, hey, that's a billionaire, this is a person who's minimum wage, but the minimum wage and the billionaire are living together, breaking bread together and supporting each other. And how do we create a community that can bring these people along? Because if we are going to just throw laws and regulations and force people to do it, it's not. We have to build a community so that the community is supporting each other. It's not somebody who's, once again, like a savior effect, coming in and trying to save everybody.
Yeah, and that's a great way to kind of, they've seen, you know, it combats the NIMBYism that we see here, so common. Assemblymember Lee, any priorities you're focusing on addressing in the coming years, or if not, I have another question for you.
I just wanted to plug also in addition to the incredible work that we are pushing on progress with legislation, is the incredible work that we are doing in the budget side. And I'm sure Senator Skinner, as our former budget chair, will understand how difficult this year in the budget was. In fact, most of the affordable housing money was actually on the chopping block this year, but thanks to our efforts in the legislature and a lot of negotiating, we saved a lot of the basic things like light tech and a lot of basic affordable housing money and homelessness money that we have kind of forgotten, that we take for granted almost. But it is important to remember that none of this is set in stone, and especially under budgetary circumstances, the stuff that we rely on just to do the basic minimal, and when, of course, we want to advance and do further, like Vino was talking about, we want to do mixed income communities that are affordable, that are actually sustainable financially and socially. That stuff is an evolution from where we are now. And so a lot of the work we've done in this year and perhaps even next year will be to defend the money we have and to really make sure that the money that we're delivering out the door also produces the outcomes we desire, because as dollars are tighter and public scrutiny, of course, is rightfully much stronger, we have to deliver on the results. So I just wanted to echo that, the incredible work that we've done in the legislature, and especially under Senator Skinner when we had good money, and then, when you left, it's suddenly with no money. But it's really important to make sure we protect those gains too.
Thank you. Appreciate that. So a follow-up question for you, Assemblymember Lee. What can members of the private sector do to encourage government to establish socialized housing? There's a question about someone being unfamiliar with the concept and what would a minimum viable product look like? How long might it take before we see one established?
Yeah, so I mean, social housing in its most basic 5,000-foot level is when the government has a strong role in the production of affordable housing for many different mixed incomes. And it's, yeah, so that's the most basic definition you can have. And you see this play out in international concepts as well as American. And one way to really help this in some of the bills we talked about is when you unify the production capacity with the financing capacity, which we are trying in different regions, even in California and the state right now, to unify these things together. And when you put them together, you will have things like Montgomery County, which is in Maryland. It's a county that's outside of DC. It's smaller than many of our counties, of course. But they're able to house tens of thousands of, or serve tens of thousands of renter family households now. And they've only really been up and running for maybe in this form a decade or so. And so it can be quite quick once you get all the ingredients together. And you're also seeing live right now, Seattle embark upon their social housing developer, which they approved via ballot in 2023 and is yet to break ground on anything, but it created the entity. And then of course in LA with the big La Casa, their agency, they hope to also do some social housing models there too. So you're seeing the kind of the dawn of the American social housing age right now. And I think really what we've seen from our friends in Europe and Asia really is sometimes it only takes maybe a decade before you start. Once you get all the things set up, just like any startup, you know, everything flies out the door more quickly after that point.
Stephen, thank you so much.
Stephen, you're muted.
There we go. Just to comment on that is that the land trust or public ownership of land is a key tool for that. And there are very compelling reasons to say we should never sell land. It's something we perpetually will want to have. Housing that we built 55 years ago, we can decide how is that land going to be reused. And we are making an investment in our future if we hold on to the land and lease it on terms that are appropriate to the type of product being built. If for market rate, charge a full lease. For lower income, we can reduce the price as a subsidy. So we can't forget the role of public land in all that discussion.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I've heard a lot about people here in LA saying that they want to see big demonstration projects of social housing happen on larger sites that are more of what Stephen was referring to earlier, you know, the multifamily coming together with ownership opportunities. And, you know, with social housing or publicly driven and funded housing, almost like housing, you know, public housing, you have opportunities for decommodifying housing and not making ownership necessary, but allowing people to transfer their unit to other generations in their family, which is also a beautiful thing. And the mixing, you know, that Vino you were talking about earlier. So I hope it's sooner than 10 years, but fingers crossed. Senator Skinner, in relation to preventing up hedge funds, there's been a question about how they can gobble up foreclosed homes. What can we do as private citizens that don't necessarily own a house curb those behaviors?
Private citizens, wow. I mean, local governments could put limitations. I'm not aware of any of our state laws that would impede the local government from putting limitations on this corporate buy-up of the single-family homes. Our attempts to try to put the limitations statewide, we've run up against some powerful interests who've stopped it so far. But when we look at home ownership is obviously something that is core to not only Californians' sort of dream, but Americans' dream. And it's the way that many families have built intergenerational wealth. And we know that, you know, many of our families of color were denied home ownership for years and years, and they finally were able to break through that when there was fair housing laws and redlining eliminated and such. But now we're finding that once again, we have the lowest level of home ownership in California right now, and very, very low levels of Black home ownership and Latino home ownership. Latino better, but so, and partly why is, you know, yes, the cost of housing, but because these corporate entities can buy up many, many properties at a time, cash sales, they can outcompete a homeowner. So I hope the legislature doesn't give up on this. And there's even federal bills. I'm not very optimistic that they would get through, but there's people in Congress that have recognized this as a real problem. You see now in the presidential debate, and also not just the corporate housing, but housing in general being a priority. So I'm even though we've failed so far, I'm optimistic, and we just got to hang in there. It takes a while.
Well, I wish we had more time because this has been so great, especially getting into the Q&A and hearing from all of you and your diverse perspectives. So thank you each for sharing some of your morning and afternoon with us. Really appreciate it. There was a couple questions we still wanted to get to on short-term vacation rentals and state level barriers to developing housing, but next time. Now I'll turn it back over to Carrie, who will close us out. And thank you all again so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you to our panelists and our speakers and our moderators and everybody for joining today and asking questions. As I mentioned, we'll be sharing this out with all the registered attendees, the recording and the presentation slides, and they'll also be posted to the SANDAG webpage, hopefully here in the next couple weeks, pretty soon. So thank you again, and have a good rest of your Tuesday.